this unit, we've talked about fluctuations in our consciousness or different states of consciousness that happen throughout the course of our day. So, for example, we sleep roughly a third of our day, and that accounts for one particular state of consciousness. Even within the sleep cycle, there are different levels of consciousness. Back in our previous chapter, we talked about altered states of consciousness that can occur from psychoactive drugs and the actions that they have at the synaptic level in our brain. And now we're speaking a little bit more generally about what consciousness is and how our consciousness functions. Our consciousness is our awareness. It's our awareness of ourselves and of our environment. And I say it's our subjective awareness because our own personal consciousness is influenced by everything that makes us who we are, our values, our prior experiences. All of this makes up kind of the lens through which we see the world and we experience our awareness. One of my favorite elements of this course to teach is the notion that we largely operate on an autopilot. The vast majority of cognitive processing we do is unconscious. It happens on this low road. We are largely unconscious beings. The brain, in an effort to conserve energy, it's very habitual, let me put it that way. We tend to be in this autopilot. We are very much creatures of habit, which is why it's so difficult to break a habit or to start a new habit. It requires a lot of repetition so that it becomes natural for the brain to carry out that habit. So if we think about this high road versus this low road, we're referring to the high road as our conscious awareness, our conscious or effortful processing that we do. And it involves the cerebral cortex. It involves the hippocampus, particularly the cerebral cortex. I mention the hippocampus because really in order to think of anything, in order for anything to be in our working memory, it involves the hippocampus retrieving that information from where it is stored in networks of neurons in our cerebral cortex. But the cortex is where all of our higher order thinking and awareness is occurring. The low road, we're referring to kind of the more primitive parts of the brain, our automatic responses. So, for example, the fight or flight response is an excellent example of that low road in action. If I encounter something that I'm scared of, like a spider, that low road responds. The amygdala kicks in and perhaps even sends a signal to the hypothalamus, which then sends a signal to the pituitary gland to secrete stress hormones before I've even had a chance to consciously think about the stimulus in front of me. I want you to think about a time where your body so naturally and innately responded in fear before you even had a chance to process what was happening in front of you. That physiological fear response where all of a sudden your heart is racing, your palms are sweating, your mind is foggy. That happens oftentimes on this unconscious level before our high road or our conscious awareness even has an opportunity to kick in. So we move about the world largely on an unconscious, unconsciously. Automatic processing. Think about when you're walking through the halls at school, you've got a big presentation coming up. You're able to process effortfully all of the planning involved and rehearsal involved in giving that presentation that's coming up. Whereas, you're walking and you're breathing and you're moving about the halls without even having to think about it. Okay? I just think this is such an important theme of the course because when we come back to this in Chapter 7, we're going to talk about cognitive biases. How do we look at the world in a very biased way? How do we make snap judgments about other people in particular without having any kind of a conscious awareness of what we're thinking or how we then act on those thoughts? It's just so important for us to understand this unconscious processing and these unconscious judgments that we make so that we can stop ourselves and recognize it and retrain our thoughts. One of, I think, the saddest examples that I use of this dual track mind, or the autopilot in particular, is when you hear those just horrific stories of parents that accidentally leave a child in a hot car. Every time I see a story like that, the comments on social media are heartbreaking because you have so many people blaming the parent. However, if you were to ask a neuroscientist, they will tell you what I am telling you, which is that the brain is a creature of habit. Okay? So there's a part of the brain called the basal ganglia, which is essentially the brain's autopilot. So when that parent, if their routine involves going straight to work every day, and then all of a sudden one day, let's say it's typically the one partner that takes the child to daycare, and that partner can't do it, so they hand it off to the other partner who is just in that habit of going straight to work. That's where sometimes you see these really, really sad things happen, is when the partner who's now tasked with taking the child to daycare has broken routine. And we're such creatures of habit that they arrive at work and they forget the child is in the car. That's why they'll tell parents, if you've got your child in the back seat and you're out of your normal routine, put your shoe in the back seat as a reminder that that kid is back there. It's a really scary thing. But again, just an example of this autopilot and the basal ganglia at work. So just a very short history of studying the consciousness. If you remember back to Unit 1, we talked about early psychology having a focus on the consciousness, structuralism, functionalism in particular. Then this backlash from the behaviorists who are like, no, consciousness is way too subjective to study. It's unscientific. We can only study what's observable. Well, in comes the advent of cognitive neuroscience. All of a sudden now we have computers, we have imaging techniques that actually give us windows into what's happening in people's brains when they're performing certain tasks or they're thinking certain things. This results in cognitive neuroscience, which is what studies how our brain activity is linked with our mental processes. So in other words, when I'm thinking about love, what parts of my brain are activated? What neurons in what regions of my brain are actually firing? So cognitive neuroscience has been enabled by the advent of technology like functional MRIs in particular, which we've already learned about, which track brain activity via blood flow in areas of the brain that have the most electrical activity. And this brings us to our last thing for today, which is talking about the inefficiency and really our inability to multitask. Sequential processing or serial processing is what we're using whenever we're doing a conscious process. So me texting on the phone and driving, these are two conscious processes that both involve me having to assign my attention to the task that's in front of me. I cannot do both simultaneously. What that means is that I might not realize it. I'm not multitasking if I'm texting and I'm driving. I am just quickly switching back and forth between the two tasks. Another good example is studying and listening to music. And people will tell you this works and that you like it. However, there's research that shows that even a slight shift in the tempo of music is enough to take your attention from your studying and shift it over to the music itself. And these then are two conscious processes that are both pulling at your attention. You're not actually doing both at the same time. You're doing what we call task switching. We cannot multitask two conscious processes. On the other hand, non-conscious processes involve what's called parallel processing. Parallel meaning we can do them at the same time. Walking, talking, breathing, chewing gum. You could do these things simultaneously because they don't involve your conscious awareness and you don't have to have your attention assigned to the task. So you're going to watch this little clip called Your Brain on Multitasking, and it's going to give you a little bit more of insight on multitasking.